Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Hey gang, how are you doing today? I am super excited this morning to have a real treat for you. Exactly 1 year ago this week, I sat down with one of the world's most influential management thinkers. That's according to Thinker 50, Whitney Johnson. If you didn't catch that show, it was episode 24, and we deep dove into her terrific book, Disrupt Yourself. And if you remember, I recorded that episode from Scotland with terrible Wi-Fi and even dropped the call once mid-sentence. I was so embarrassed. Fast forward to today. With better Wi-Fi, I have the privilege of welcoming Whitney back for a deep dive into her newest book, Build an A-Team. Play to their strengths and lead them up the learning curve. Before we get too deep, I want to add that Whitney is a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, has over 1 million followers on LinkedIn. That's incredible. Was an award-winning Wall Street analyst and co-founded the Disruptive Innovation Fund with Clayton Christensen. On top of all that, she is married with 2 children. Whitney, you are one of my all-time favorite guests. Welcome back to Modern Leadership.
Thank you for having me, Jake.
It's so fun. We're going to get into this, but before we do, the first time we had you on, we talked about your journey from Goldman Sachs temp to dominant Wall Street analyst during the South American mobile explosion, and of course, your book, Disrupt Yourself. This time, we want to get you back in and talk about A-teams. So tell us, why this book? Why now?
Such a good question. So what happened is after I wrote Disrupt Yourself, which outlined for people, how do you know when it's time to make a big change? And then here are 7 steps for how to do that effectively. I had a lot of people, as I was writing and speaking and consulting, say to me, okay, I get it. Like, I got it. I'm ready. I'll do it. I'll disrupt myself. And then they'd say, but how do I get my boss to let me do it? And if I have people on my team, how do I get my team to do it? And so whereas Disrupt Yourself was for you or is for you as an individual, Build an A-Team is my answer to this is for you, the manager. How do you create an ecosystem where disruption happens?
And I think for a lot of our entrepreneurs listening right now and business leaders, this is you're making an important point, and that is listening to those around you for what the need is. There's this need being created around you. Listen to what that is. So you hear this need, and then what happens?
And so and the other thing that was happening too is that people would say to me, well, I'm not going to let people in my company read Disrupt Yourself because then they might leave. And I was like, well, okay, that might be true. But I think there's a bigger question here, which is, in my whole hypothesis is that, companies don't disrupt people do, but if you will let your people disrupt themselves inside the company, they're not only not going to leave, they're going to allow you as an organization to be more disruptive. And so that was really, okay, I want to write this book because I want to build this case for why you as an entrepreneur in particular, as you're trying to figure out, okay, things are working, we're developing, I had this vision, I brought all these people on board, they caught my vision, but now as I'm trying to ship product, I have this sense of I need them to do right what they've done, stay right where they are doing what they've always done. And I'm not allowing them to disrupt themselves. And by not doing that, I'm going to, over time, lose my competitive edge. And I wanted to say, let your people do new things, allow them to learn, to leap and repeat. And in the process of doing that, not only are they going to be more engaged and therefore you will ship more product, you're going to become a boss that people want to work for because they know that they're always going to have fun when they're at work because they're always going to be learning.
I think there's a lot of listeners right now that are sitting on the edge of their seats. They've sat up a little bit with that intro because on this podcast, we talk a lot about, how people are kind of job jumping. They're shifting jobs a lot. And we as business owners and business leaders are trying to keep the best talent. And we don't want to see them leave. And we often joke about the Zig Ziglar quote that says, what's worse than training your employees and having them leave? It's not training them and having them stay. And so I think you got a lot of listeners that are interested in this conversation. And so you really have 2 target audiences with this book. The first is those who read Disrupt Yourself that want to apply some of these principles within their work and want their boss or leadership to see that. So that's target number one. The second then would be bosses and leadership that are saying, I want to keep my people. They're going to disrupt anyway. I mean, there's this groundswell of disruption happening anyway. I need to kind of get in front of this by learning these principles. Am I catching that correctly?
Yeah, you are, and I really like how you framed it of understanding or recognizing and teaching me something about how to think about it. Is that again, it's for people who read the first book, want to apply it, and now there's a whole different audience, which is a person who is building a business. They're trying to retain their talent, and how do they do that? And I would actually add a third audience, which is someone who's been growing a business and they're actually very competitive. They're riding high. They're really happy. And they're like, I wonder if we're at risk in some form or fashion. And what I would posit is that if you want to know if you're about to be disrupted, the only thing you actually have to do is take the pulse of your workforce. Because if you've got too many people who are bored, and we can talk in a minute about how to figure that out, you're actually at risk. And so then the question becomes, and this is what this book answers, is how do you know if people are bored? So if you want, we can talk about that.
Yeah, let's definitely do that. Before we do have to shout out and basically say, this book is screaming on the charts, Whitney. You're doing an awesome job. We hit #1 on Amazon. People are resonating with this message. And so those who are listening on the podcast need to hook up their seatbelts and buckle in, because we are going to go for a great ride here. We can't talk about too much because of just the nature of a shorter podcast, but let's dive into chapter 4 and really talk about, you talk about the S curve of disruption, the S curve of learning now in building a team. Let's talk about what these 7 principles of this S curve of learning are.
Yeah, so the first one is to identify the right kinds of risks. And the way you think about this when you're a hiring manager is we tend to like to hire the way we've always hired. Someone may move or leave. And so you look at the job description and you try to hire exactly what you hired before. And one of the ways you can take the right risks is to be willing to say, okay, is that what we really need? Like maybe there's something that we need that we don't even realize that we need. And this person that left, it's giving us a huge opportunity. The other way you can take a market risk when it comes to hiring is we tend to want to get the most qualified person on the face of the planet, when in fact, that's not the person who's maybe going to do the best job. And so you can take a market risk by hiring where no one else is hiring. You can hire people who are actually internal that you've never looked at before because they've become like wallpaper to you. You can hire people who are on-ramping, who are coming back into the workforce. People who have been getting a crash course or a master class, however you want to think about it, in soft skills because they've been taking care of parents or children. Hire people that are boomerangers, people that you've worked with before, they've left, and you felt a little bit like, oh, that boyfriend, that girlfriend, they jilted me, I don't want them back. But the fact is you can work with them, and they've been getting all these skills that someone else has been paying for. So boomerangers can make a lot of sense. And then finally, be willing to take a look at people who are self-taught. A lot of people in the United States will not ever have college degrees, but there's a subset of those people who are self-taught, who teach themselves, who take initiative. Be willing to consider those people as well. And so that's one way that you can build an A team. You hire where no one else is hiring, and it's taking on market, rather competitive risk. So that's a starting point.
Let's talk about this one for just a second, because I agree with you, and everything that you just talked about really resonates with me, especially as I've gone in and out of the job market at different times in my life. I've seen where on the I want to be your employee side, I say, why are you cutting me out based on some of these factors, which really have no impact? But from a practical perspective, and so theoretically, I agree with you. From a practical perspective, this is a very difficult step for us to take. And part of this is because currently, right now, while we're recording this, unemployment is very low. There's a lot of great people that have a lot of great degrees, a lot of great experience, a lot of great background in the marketplace right now. I guess I'm asking, is the need to take this risk now very high, or is it?
I think it's a fair question. What I would say is you don't have to. I mean, you can hire people who are fully qualified. what I would say, and you're right, it is hard to do because, for example, I know for me right now, I need to hire some new people. It's certainly easier to hire someone who can already do the job, especially if there's a part of your business that you don't actually know how to do, so you can't necessarily train them. But I think that's where freelancers come in. You know, we've got this wonderful gig economy. We're talking to entrepreneurs. You can have people come in for a brief period of time as a consultant and help the people at the bottom of the curve, the bottom of the learning curve, come in. And so I think that's one option. The other thing I would say is just remember is that time plus competence equals boredom. And so while you can hire people who are in the sweet spot of their learning curve at the high end of the curve, that's absolutely fine. Just understand that you're only going to have them because you really can only be on one curve at most for 4 years. So if you've hired someone who's in the middle or at the high end, then you're maybe going to get 6 months, a year, 18 months at most. And so be aware that within that 18 months, they're going to be bored and ready for something new to do. So are you going to be willing to let them move on, help them do that gracefully and graciously, et cetera? So to answer your question, no, you don't need to do it, but you also need to understand what the upside and the downside are of doing that.
And something you said that really jumped out to me is very interesting. You talk about this 4 years as this time period where they go through this S-curve and they get to the top of the S-curve, which in a minute we're going to talk about the scariest part of the S-curve right at the top, where you basically have that time plus confidence equals boredom, and then you start slipping. But what you said kind of triggered something that's interesting. You said this 4 years from the perspective of the employer, and we've talked about the perspective of time from the employee, right? A millennial will stay in the job for 2 years, and an Xer will stay in for 4, a boomer for 6. And we often talk about when the employee is going to leave. But I think what you're saying is sometimes we got to think about this from the employer's perspective and say, there are times when we need to disrupt what's going on with our employees, not that they're going to, because we need them to stay active and engaged. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's exactly what I'm hearing. And so you're going to have some people who work for you who are like chomping at the bit, and sometimes maybe even too soon, but they've gotten to 3 years, maybe 4. And it's interesting that you just said that 6, 4, and 2 year, that the cycle gets compressed depending on what cohort you're in. But you are going to have some people who will come to you and say, okay, it's time for me to do something new, which takes an incredible amount of confidence. But you as a leader, you as a manager, it's important for you to recognize that when someone gets to the top of the curve, because the power is asymmetrical, you as the leader or the boss hold most of the power. Frequently, you're going to have to say to the person, I know you're at the top of this curve, and not frequently, sometimes, and I know it feels really comfortable to you and you kind of like it, but the fact is that you are starting to get bored, and when you get bored, you're not going to do your best work, which is going to, over time, erode your confidence in yourself. And it's also bad business for us, because unless you are in this place where you haven't figured everything out, you're not going to be able to contribute to the business in the same way that you could when you are still figuring things out. And so it's a both and. It's for the benefit of the employee, and it's for the benefit of you, the employer, in the business.
Oh, this is a great conversation. Let's move on to number 2.
Yeah. So the number 2 is to play to your distinctive strengths. And the thing that I would say here is, as an employee, we oftentimes don't know what our strengths are because they're things that we do so reflexively well. They're so easy for us. We don't value them because we don't tend to value things that come easily for us. So that's on the part of the employee. But as an employer, one of your jobs is to be able to identify those strengths, to recognize that you might hire someone initially not quite into the right seat because they're going to lead with what they do well, not with what they do best. And so that first 3 to 6 months is you want to be really observing closely, like what's their actual superpower, and be willing over time to move them around. Now, the tough part is that when you do decide that you want to move them around, they may resist it because they're going to feel like, wait, they want me to go back and do that easy thing? Like they're demoting me. They must not like me. What you're really doing is you're saying to them, I've spotted your superpower. And if you're willing to own this superpower and put yourself into stretch situations using this superpower, then you're going to really be able to make a contribution. And so that's part of your job as a leader, as a manager, is to not only identify that strength, move people into a role where they can play to that strength, say to them, I value it, therefore you should too, and your contribution will be greater as a consequence.
This happens a lot of times in larger organizations where as we start to move people up, because the company is constantly changing, as people start to get moved up, we move them up too quickly. They do good job at job A, so we think they're going to be great at job B. So we give them more responsibility, more management, more leadership, but they're not ready for it. And then that, what we got to be careful of. And I'm not saying that we don't want to move our people up and we don't want to give them opportunities for growth, but we also got to recognize that there's opportunities for growth by not just moving up in the organization by expanding, but also by expanding your role within the organization and learning more. I call it the foundation, basically building up this foundation of employment where you understand and know more parts about the company that makes you more invaluable as an employee. So that's number 2. What's number 3?
Yeah, number 3 is a willingness to impose thoughtful constraints. One of the things that we know from the law of physics is that you have to have friction. Nothing moves without friction. It's very counterintuitive, and yet it's true. It might be nice to stand on ice, but you can't get anywhere if you don't have the friction. And it's the same with people. Once people get into the sweet spot of their learning, which is that steep part of the curve, it's easy to say, well, they're doing a good job, I'll just let them be. But that's actually the time where they need friction, and friction in the form of challenges, friction in the form of stretch assignments, etc. And so what I would say is you impose those thoughtful constraints by giving them assignments that are hard, but not too hard. So the Goldilocks assignments. And it's interesting because when people are in this sweet spot, they're doing a good job. And so it's easy to ignore them and not pay attention to them because they're not a problem child. And what I would say is this is a huge opportunity for you. First of all, you don't want them to become a problem child because you're ignoring them. But more importantly, once you've gotten them into that sweet spot and they're playing to their strengths, if you will impose thoughtful constraints, thoughtful challenges in terms of having them do things in, less time than they've done before, or give them a really challenging assignment where there's the risk of failure, then you're basically putting them into a box, a proverbial box that they have to get out of. And that's going to cause them to be innovative for them and innovative on behalf of the company. So that's what the thoughtful piece is. It's the Goldilocks, hard, but not too hard.
I love that, Goldilocks assignments. How about our next one?
Yeah. So the next one is a willingness to step back as a way to move forward. And I touched on this just briefly, and maybe I'll tell you a quick story around that to really illustrate this point. This idea of playing to your strengths. So there was a fellow by the name of John Cave, and he works at the NFL. And he, over the last couple of years, has really advanced the game of advanced technology for the NFL. And yet I wonder if this wouldn't have happened had it not been for his boss, Michelle McKenna Doyle, who said, you know what, you've got these strengths, you're managing all the systems. What you're really good at is building things. And so the step back here is she took a lot of his responsibility away so that he could have the bandwidth, the emotional and these, intellectual bandwidth to build things. And so sometimes you've got to take a step back, have fewer assignments or different kinds of assignments in order to catapult or slingshot forward. And so as a manager or a boss, you're going to have to manage that and persuade them that step back is actually a slingshot for them. It's not, in fact, a demotion.
And one of the things you said is taking some of the things off their plate, which is going to be very hard. It's going to go actually against the wave or the tide of what we do within our businesses, because what we naturally do is when somebody is performing high performing, we tend to give them more assignments and say, oh, they're doing so well at this, let's give them more to do. And that takes their ability to strategize, their ability to invent or to innovate away from them. So what you're saying is at times we're going to have to dial it back a little bit, give them a little more space or a little more freedom in order to move forward in a different direction or in something brand new that's so important for the organization moving forward.
And they're going to resist it because even though they know it could be good, it's going to make them feel bad because we tend to equate busy with unvaluable. And so you've got to manage that. I'm taking this away so that you can create. This is not me taking this away because you're underperforming. And so you've really got to manage the psychology around that. It's a tough one to do, but you can do it.
And so far, we've talked about, in all of these, you've talked about this feeling of uncomfortability or stretch or, kind of disrupting the flow of what's going on. And this is all leading to, like I said, where we get to the top of the learning S curve, which is a scary place to be. And we'll get there in just a minute. But I want to point out that so far, in every one of these, you've talked about creating this anxiety, not to cause problems, but to cause innovation, to cause movement, to cause growth. Just like when you're working out or when you're exercising, that stimulation, that stress on the body causes growth, just the same way in our development as employees and development as leaders.
That's right.
So our next one.
Yeah, the next one, this is number 5. It's to give failure its due. So, not all failure can be sidestepped, and, it shouldn't be. There's going to be times when people have been a star performer in the past and now they're not. Sometimes it's because they're not working, but I would argue that frequently they aren't a star performer because you've moved them and it's not the right curve. And that's, that happens. It's just like you try products and you try different markets. Sometimes, one market sticks and one market doesn't. It's the same with people. You move them around, they're star performer. This role didn't quite work. Okay, let's move them to somewhere else. What I would say is that frequently with failure, when you're managing people, is that they attach that failure, and you used Zig Ziglar earlier, I'm going to quote him now, is failure is an event, not a person. And so often we attach failure to our identity. And so oftentimes as a manager, your job is to say, okay, this didn't work. Now my job is to encourage you and say, get back on the horse, keep going. This role maybe not be right. Let's move you around. This project didn't work. Let's keep going. And what I would say is, as a boss, if you're not willing to let people who work for you fail, because we're all willing to let people fail all the time, if you think about it, it means there's something else going on. And so you've got to analyze psychologically what's happening. But overall, you give it its due by understanding that if you can take the shame out of it, failure is just someone putting what's gone into their brain in action, testing it. Is it working or not? Moving on. What's the ROI? Keep going. Move up the curve.
And I recently heard a story about Sarah Blakely. She's the youngest self-made female billionaire who invented Spanx. And the story is told that as she was growing up, every night at dinner, she would sit around the table with her father, and her father would ask all the children, what did you fail at today? And what did you do to grow? And she claims that or uses that as a story to say, this propelled me to constantly feel like I could change and grow, and that failure wasn't who I was, but it was a natural part of me becoming who I can potentially become. And so I love that one. That's number 5. Where do we go with number 6?
Number 6, I think I've skipped something. Let's just think for a second. Okay, we said number 1 was right risks. Number 2 was strengths. Number 3 was constraints. Number 4, we missed battle entitlement. Oh my goodness. Okay, we have to back up for a second because that's like a big, big one. And battling entitlement is this belief that as a manager, it's like everything's humming, right? Your margins are expanding, your revenue's growing, your team's humming, you're humming. And battling entitlement as a manager is, I built this team, I deserve a fiefdom. And so now it's time for someone on your team to jump to a new curve because at the top of the curve, and you don't want to let them go because you deserve a fiefdom. And so one of the biggest, I would say this is the sneaky saboteur of innovation because we don't want to let people go. And yet, if we're really going to be innovative, yes, our people are sometimes entitled, but we as managers are as well. So we just had to light touch that. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5 was step back to grow. Number 6 was failure. And number 7 is to be discovery driven. As a disruptor, you're in search of a yet to be defined market. You're trying to play where other people haven't played. You don't know what that looks like. And so as a manager, the way you want to think about this with your people is to recognize that you're going to have them try one role and it may work, it may not work. And so if you think about the theory of disruption, the odds of success when you play where no one else is playing are 6 times higher, but that's still 36% 6% to 36%, there's still 64% chance it's not the right curve. So there's a lot of iteration that goes on with people. And one thing that I think is really interesting, if you look at the Utah Jazz, which did very well this season, their coach, Quinn Snyder, he has lots and lots of different configurations, like 22 different starting lineups, because he's trying to figure out how to optimize his available resources, which in this case is people. And so as a leader, as a manager, what you want to do, bring people in. You think they're good at one thing, test that. Are they in fact good at this? And as you get more and more familiar with what they're doing, be willing to discover your way to finding the exact right curve for them. All this assumes that they're hard workers. But once you know that they are, then you iterate until you find the right role.
And I love that you brought up this sports analogy, because when you look at leading at a very high stress, high difficulty level, sports is professional sports has got to be one of the most difficult leadership positions, because you've got the egos, you've got the paychecks, you've got the desire to be number one. You've got all these players getting out there. They want to be on the court or on the field or on the ice or whatever they're doing. And you've got this leader that's basically trying to slow down all these egos without taking away the swagger that they need to get out there and perform at a high level. And so I love that you brought that analogy up, or that story up, to close us out. Our time is running a little bit low, and before I let you go, I want to talk just briefly about the scariest part of the learning curve and why it's so scary. And this is the top, because I think intuitively, or we would think that this is a great place for our employees to be. So why don't you tell us what the top of the S curve looks like and why it's so scary?
Yeah, so the top of the S curve, on the one hand, is exciting because you're on the top of this mountain. And so there's this vista to be able to examine all that you've been able to achieve. At the same time, because you're at the top, you are now know what you're doing. And because you know what you're doing, what's happening in your brain is you're no longer learning. And when you're no longer learning, you get bored. And so if you don't jump to do something new, this mountaintop, this plateau quickly becomes a precipice. And if you don't jump, then you might get pushed off. So you can actually precipitate your own demise. And so for you as a manager, what you want to do is, instead of saying, they're a master, this is fantastic, you say to yourself, they're a master, I'm in trouble. So I've got to figure out, what are we going to do? Because they're bored now. So am I going, and so they might leave, or as you said earlier, they might get bored and complacent and stay. So what do? Well, in an ideal world, you find a new curve for them to jump to, ideally within your team, if not on your team, inside of your organization. And if not inside of your organization, then you help them find something with a client or with a vendor. They may not even be able to do any of those things, but if you're willing to develop people, then you become a talent magnet. And what I would argue is then you not only build one A team within your company, but over a career, you build vast networks of A teams, because you've had all these people who learned and grew and developed because of you.
And so you just focused, and by the way, I love this, you just focused on what we can do as employers or as leaders, but we also got to take a look at this internally as ourselves and say, where are we at on our own learning curve? Are we at this top part? Because it can be scary for us too. If we feel ourselves starting to get bored, getting complacent, this is a time where we need to start looking for a new learning curve for us. And like you said, it doesn't mean we have to look outside our company or outside our team, but we do need to find something to re-engage and re-excite us. So not just for leaders, but also for us as followers of other leaders, do we need to look at this top part of the curve as scary. Now, Whitney, we just went through basically a small portion, less than probably 3% of the entire book. There's many more chapters about implementing this and some of the background and research behind it, including stories and examples of how this plays out in the real world. And so, huge recommendation to all the listeners to go out, grab a copy of the book. It's there right on Amazon. You click right on it, you can find it. Before we let you go though, Whitney, we have this section, and we did this before with you last year. It's called Learning from Leaders. We basically take a look at what you're reading and what you're recommending. And so last time we talked, you were reading a Scott Lynch book, The Lies of Locke Lamora. I understand you didn't like it. It wasn't a recommendation at the time. What's on your bookshelf now?
Well, this time I have a book that I can highly recommend, and it is again fiction. It is again fantasy. It's by Brandon Sanderson. It's Oathbringer. It's the third in a series of The Way of Kings. He's an amazing writer. Anybody who follows fantasy will know of him. If you follow Orson Scott Card, Ender's Game, he's like the next generation of him. Just a brilliant storyteller. It's a wonderful characters, wonderful story. So I highly recommend his work. Yeah, so that's it. That's what's on my nightstand.
The audience gets to take a little detour with us right now because I got to tell you a little story that you're going to love. So I have a 12-year-old daughter who's a writer. And when we spent the year abroad, she spent some time writing. She wrote an 85,000 word book, which is equivalent to the first Harry Potter, which was her goal. Her favorite author is Brandon Sanderson. And she's going to a writing camp over the summer where Brandon's going to be there, and she's got a one-on-one 1 hour to sit down with him and have him look at her work. And she is like beyond excited about this experience.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So when you said Brandon, I had to tell the story.
Oh, good for her. Good for working so hard. Good for her having this opportunity. Oh, that should be life-changing. Please tell her congratulations.
It's kind of fun. So the camp is for 13 to 18. She's only 12, but we called them and got permission to send her at a younger age. So very exciting. All right, back to our regularly scheduled program. The final question I have for you before we get into basically the conclusion, and that is the book you're most often gifting to friends, colleagues, and anybody else that needs growth.
Currently, there are two, I either gifting or find myself just talking about them incessantly. One is Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Work Week. I think, it's fascinating to me that this was written 12, 13 years ago. It's still super relevant. To me, it was seminal. So that's a book that I talk about a lot and find myself recommending that people buy it. And then the other one is a book called Born Rich by Bob Proctor, who, if you're familiar with The Secret, he was featured in that, although I haven't seen it, but I came across him not too long ago. I was speaking on a panel with him at Junior Achievement and came across his work. He's really focused on human potential, really powerful stuff, and I've recommended his book, I don't even know how many times now. So those are the two.
Both books that I will join you in recommending. All right, Whitney, before we let you go, any last bit of advice, and where can we find out more about you and, of course, pick up a copy of Build an A-Team?
Yeah, so you can find me, you can go to my website, whitneyjohnson.com / if you want to figure out, or / diagnostic, if you want to figure out where you are on your current learning curve. Are you at the bottom? Are you in the middle, at the top? So it's like 3 or 4 minutes and it will tell you that. So that's one way. Another is you can listen to my podcast, the Disrupt Yourself podcast. So those are two easy ways. Obviously, thank you for buying the book. I hope that you love it. And my last piece of advice, I actually have 2 pieces of advice. One is that shame limits disruption, not failure. So if you're struggling to fail, it's not because the failure is the problem. It's because you're experiencing shame. And so that's something that you want to work through. And this goes back to partly the Bob Proctor work, is separating out the shame from your identity. And then the second one I would say is that if you're scared and you're lonely, then you're on the right path to disruption, because you're playing where no one else is playing. You're going to be scared. It's going to feel a little bit lonely. But when that happens, know that it's on the right path. It's not the wrong path. It's the right path. So be a little scared, be a little bit lonely.
And if you want to be a leader, you're going to have to get out in front of your people. And that can be a lonely journey as you're climbing that mountain. Whitney, it is awesome to have you back. Thank you so much for carving out just a little bit of time to spend with us. As always, it's hugely beneficial. So much value. Congratulations on the new book and all the success that you're having.
Thank you, Jake, for having me.
Well, you can see why Whitney is one of my favorite guests to have on the show. Every time she comes on, she delivers so much value. I love her style of creating these lists, these 7 steps that you can know if you're on this S-curve of learning. And we didn't get too much time to go into all the nuances of how to get on the learning curve and defining it. We just walked through really those 7 steps, or the 7 places on the learning curve that you could be. A couple of point outs that I want to bring up, and that is the first one: time plus competence equals boredom. And this is no good whether you're a leader or whether you're a follower. If you have too much time and too much competence, and you're lacking in this excitement, this passion, you're not taking the stairs two at a time, well, what happens? Your inefficiency goes way down. Productivity is not where it could be. And the more bored you get, the more mistakes you're going to make, and the more opportunities you're going to miss. So make sure that if you find yourself slipping into that time plus competence, that you do something to disrupt yourself. You get on a new learning curve, as Whitney talked about. And then I love this Goldilocks assignments. You don't want them to be too hard that they demotivate people and discourage, and you don't want them so easy that they fall onto this time plus competence equals boredom. What you want is these Goldilocks assignments that are just right, that push you just hard enough to grow and develop into your potential. Of course, everything that we talked about on this episode can be found on the show notes, jakeacarlson.com/ML76. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. Keep disrupting and stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.